In the mini lecture that introduced Unit 5, I suggested that there is a popular notion of the Reformation that suggests that it came about largely because the Catholic Church was so corrupt, so mired in tradition, that Catholic popes were only interested in political power and economic gain, and in that context, the Lord raised up a man, Martin Luther, who read Scripture with fresh eyes, began to ask, what does this mean in my context, and had the courage to go against the weight of 1,000 years of tradition and began the Protestant Reformation. That story is, I suggested, not entirely false, but it's not a complete understanding of the origins of Protestantism. And so in the next two sessions, I'd like to give a somewhat fuller picture of how the Protestant Reformation came about. I want to begin by calling your attention to the legacy of the Renaissance, and particularly how the Renaissance played itself out in Northern Europe. Recall the central themes of the Renaissance: an interest in secular culture and pagan culture of Rome and Greece, the language and literature of the era before Christ, a practical application of knowledge, a view of human beings as individuals capable of making meaningful choices, not simply responding or as to the dictates of an impersonal God. And finally, the superiority of inductive reasoning, that is, starting with the facts and moving to conclusions from the facts. One of the first humanists to begin to make a religious connection with humanist thought was a man named John Colet, a child prodigy who grew up in England, graduated from Cambridge at the age of 15, knew Latin and Greek, and then went for 3 years to Italy, where he encountered the Italian Renaissance and Renaissance humanists. He returned to England and he began to preach in a new style, an inductive style, in which he preached verse by verse, particularly from the New Testament, always asking, what did this verse or the text mean in its original context? And so, for example, when Colet preached from 1 Corinthians, he began by asking, well, what was the nature, what do we know about Corinth, the city of Corinth in the first century, about its politics, the economics, about the nature of the Roman Empire? And then he asked what Paul meant in that particular context. What was he thinking in that context? And only then, Colet suggested, can we step back and ask what the text means for us today. This inductive approach to preaching, which we take for granted today, was a revolutionary new style, and it opened up a whole host of new understandings of Scripture in which the interpreter played a key role. Another Christian humanist in the north, a Dutchman, a man by the name of Desiderius Erasmus, pushed this in yet another direction. Erasmus was also a Catholic, a loyal son of the church, but a brilliant mind who, again, knew the languages well, of Latin and Greek, studied Scripture carefully, and was sharply critical of the Catholic Church, while at the same time deeply respectful of tradition. In good humanist fashion, Erasmus began to look at the texts that were used by the Catholic Church, by the theologians of the Catholic Church. The standard text was something called the Vulgate, the Latin translation that had been passed down. And when Erasmus compared it with the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament, the fragments of manuscripts that he found in monasteries, for example, he realized that the earliest fragments were not in Latin, but they were in Greek. The ones closest to the apostles themselves were in Greek, and he set himself the task of compiling the very best of these manuscripts he could find, and he prepared in 1514 a new translation of the Scripture, drawing on these Greek manuscripts and saying this is a pure, better source for our theological reflection than the medieval texts. In the next lecture, I'll mention something